In the archives of American history, there are stories that lie buried beneath the official record, stories that were never meant to be told. They exist only in the spaces between the lines, in the silences of ledgers, and the omissions of journals. This is one such account from the year 1830, a tale from the Deep South when the Cotton Kingdom was at its zenith. It concerns a world of absolute power and absolute suffering, and a woman who was rendered invisible within it. History did not record her name, her age, or her origin. It only recorded the consequence of her existence, a single night of fire and retribution that consumed 15 men and left a legend that smolders to this day. If you are one who seeks the stories that history has tried to forget, and this is your first time entering this archive, subscribe to stand with those of us who believe that the darkest truths must be brought into the light. The year was 1830, and the world in that particular stretch of the Louisiana Low Country was defined by two things: the suffocating, wet wool heat of the air and the endless, shimmering green of the cotton fields. It was a landscape of breathtaking, deceptive beauty. Ancient live oaks, their branches heavy with the ghostly drapery of Spanish moss, stood as silent, brooding sentinels over a land that was ruthlessly, methodically being bent to the will of a single crop. The very soil, a rich, dark alluvial loam, was a source of immense, almost unimaginable wealth, a wealth that was measured in bales of cotton and the bodies of the human beings who were forced to cultivate it. The plantations were not farms, they were empires in miniature, sprawling kingdoms of white-columned mansions that seemed to float like pale, opulent ships on a sea of green, each one a testament to an order that felt as permanent and as divinely ordained as the stars in the night sky. Life here was governed by the sun and the bell. The sun rose with a brutal, indifferent intensity, its light quickly becoming a physical weight that pressed down on the shoulders and stung the eyes. It baked the moisture from the air, leaving a thick, hazy atmosphere that smelled of damp earth, sweet magnolia blossoms, and the ever-present, acrid scent of human sweat. The bell, a harsh, clanging instrument of iron, was the sun's cruel echo. It rang before dawn, calling the enslaved from their pallets in the cramped, windowless cabins. It rang to mark the beginning of the grueling, 14-hour workday in the fields. It rang to signal the meager midday meal, and it rang long after the sun had sunk below the horizon, a final, weary pronouncement that the day's labor was done. Between the first bell and the last was a lifetime of unceasing, back-breaking toil, a relentless cycle of planting, chopping, and picking that was designed to grind the human spirit down into something as pliable and as profitable as the cotton itself. Within this world of rigid, brutal order, there was a woman. She had a name given to her by those who owned her, but it was a label, not an identity, and in the silent ledger of her own mind, she was nameless. She moved through this world as a shadow, a ghost in the machine. Her assigned duties kept her primarily within the confines of the great house, a world of polished wood floors, glittering chandeliers, and the soft, rustling sounds of silk and lace. She served meals in the grand dining room, her movements fluid and silent, her face a carefully constructed mask of utter impassivity. She mended fine linen shirts in the sewing room, her fingers nimble and sure, her gaze never lifting from her work. She stoked the fires in the ornate fireplaces, her presence so unobtrusive that the masters and mistresses of the house often spoke as if she were not there, their conversations about profit margins, social engagements, and the necessary disciplining of their human property washing over her like a foul, invisible tide. She was an observer, a silent archivist of a world that saw her as little more than a piece of animate furniture. Her eyes, dark and deep-set, missed nothing. She saw the casual, almost thoughtless cruelty that was the daily currency of this place. She saw the overseer, a man named Philemon, speak to a field hand with a quiet, menacing calm that was far more terrifying than any shout. She saw the mistress of the house strike a young girl across the face for spilling a single drop of water, the sharp crack of the blow echoing in the high-ceilinged room long after the girl's stifled sob had faded. She saw the way the masters would look at the women who served them, their eyes holding a predatory gleam that stripped them of their humanity, reducing them to objects of momentary, disposable desire. She saw all of this, and she stored it away, each insult, each act of degradation, each casual demonstration of power, filed away in the vast, silent repository of her memory. Her silence was not a sign of submission, it was a form of armor, a shield that protected the small secret flame of her own consciousness from the suffocating darkness that surrounded her. There was one small, private aspect of her existence that belonged only to her. She was a gifted singer, her voice a low, resonant alto of surprising power and clarity. But she never sang the work songs in the fields or the sorrowful hymns in the cabins. She sang only to the very young children, the infants who had not yet been broken by the world they had been born into. In the dead of night, when a baby would cry from a colic or a bad dream, she would be the one to go to them. She would hold the small, warm body against her own and hum, a deep, wordless melody that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. It was a sound that was both profoundly sad and deeply comforting, a lullaby that spoke of a peace that did not exist in their waking world. This was the one act of genuine, uncoerced creation she was allowed, a small, secret gift of beauty in a world dedicated to ugliness. The masters heard it sometimes, a faint, haunting melody drifting from the cabins, and dismissed it as just another strange, primitive sound of the night. They did not understand that what they were hearing was the sound of a soul refusing to be entirely extinguished. The brutality of this world was not always a spectacle of public violence. More often, it was a quiet, grinding, systemic force, a slow and steady erosion of the self. It was the inadequate food, the threadbare clothing, the constant, gnawing exhaustion. It was the denial of family, the selling of a husband, a wife, or a child as if they were livestock, the tearing apart of human bonds for the sake of profit. It was the absolute, soul-crushing lack of agency, the knowledge that every moment of one's life, from birth to death, was owned and controlled by another. This was the foundational violence of the system, a violence so pervasive and so complete that it was as invisible and as necessary as the air they breathed. But there were also moments of acute, theatrical horror, public displays designed to reinforce the unshakable order of things. One such event took place on a suffocatingly hot afternoon in late summer. A man named Isaac had attempted to run away. He had been captured within a day, dragged back to the plantation by men on horseback, his body already bruised and bloodied. He was not taken to the whipping post immediately. Instead, he was chained to a tree in the center of the main yard, a spot visible from both the great house and the distant cabins. He was left there for the remainder of the day, a living monument to the futility of escape. The sun beat down on him without mercy. The insects, drawn by the scent of his sweat and his blood, swarmed him. He was denied water. All other work on the plantation continued as normal, but everyone was aware of the silent, suffering figure at its heart. The nameless woman, on an errand to fetch water from the well, was forced to walk directly past him. She did not allow her gaze to linger, for any display of sympathy would be noted and punished. But in the fraction of a second that her eyes met his, she saw not despair, but a profound and terrifying emptiness, the look of a man who had traveled to the absolute limit of human endurance and had found nothing there. Later that evening, as dusk began to bleed across the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, the punishment was carried out. The overseer, Philemon, administered the lash himself. He did so with a calm, almost surgical precision, his movements economical and practiced. He did not seem to be driven by rage or hatred. It was simply a job, a necessary and unpleasant task, like putting down a sick animal. The sounds carried on the still evening air, the sharp, visceral crack of the whip, the soft, sickening thud of its impact, and Isaac's initial, strangled cries, which soon gave way to a series of low, involuntary moans, and then, finally, to silence. That night, in her small, shared cabin, the woman lay on her thin straw pallet, staring into the darkness. A single, tallow candle, its flame guttering and weak, cast long, dancing shadows on the rough, unpainted wooden walls. The air inside was close and smelled of old smoke and unwashed bodies. From outside came the ceaseless, hypnotic thrum of the cicadas, and carried on a faint breeze from the direction of the main yard, the low, desolate sound of a man's weeping. It was a sound that seemed to seep into the very timbers of the cabin, a sound of a grief so profound it could never be healed. The woman listened, her body still, her face a rigid mask. She was not merely hearing the sound of one man's pain, she was hearing the accumulated pain of generations, the collective, unvoiced scream of a people. She felt the grief not as an emotion, but as a physical weight in her chest, a cold, hard knot of sorrow, and a rage so deep and so pure it had no heat. She was a vessel, and for years she had been filling, drop by painful drop, with the suffering of her world. She had witnessed the deaths, the beatings, the casual cruelties, the endless, grinding degradation. She had watched as families were shattered, as hope was extinguished, as the human spirit was treated as just another commodity to be bought, used, and discarded. Each instance was a mark, a scar on her soul. Most people saw her as a part of the scenery, a silent, obedient servant whose inner world was a complete and uninteresting void. They saw her hands mending their clothes, her body carrying their food, but they never saw her eyes. They never saw the cold, clear, and unblinking intelligence that was watching, recording, and evaluating every moment of their existence. They saw a slave. They did not see an accountant. But what no one knew, what no one could have possibly imagined, was that in the silent, secret ledger of her mind, she had been counting. The counting began not as a plan, but as a prayer. It was a silent, desperate act of remembrance in a world that demanded forgetting. In the darkest hours of the night, long after the last embers in the communal fire had died, and the exhausted breathing of the others in the cabin had settled into a shallow, troubled rhythm, she would rise from her pallet. She moved with a practiced, preternatural quiet, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth floor. The space that was hers was infinitesimally small, a narrow strip of existence between the wall and the next sleeping body. It was here, in this sliver of personal territory, that she kept her ledger. It was not a book of paper and ink. It was the rough, splintery surface of the cabin's rear wall, a space perpetually shrouded in shadow, hidden behind the thin mattress of straw and corn husks where she slept. Her tool was a single, small, sharp-edged piece of flint she had found by the riverbank weeks earlier, its edges carefully honed against a larger stone until it could bite into wood. Each night that a new debt was incurred, she would retrieve the stone from its hiding place in a crack in the floor. With the infinite patience of a stonecutter, she would press the flint into the soft pine of the wall and, with a slow, deliberate scrape, carve a single, straight line. The sound was almost non-existent, a faint, dry whisper, like an insect burrowing into wood, easily lost beneath the chirping of the crickets or a distant cough from a neighboring cabin. But to her, in the profound silence of her ritual, the sound was as loud and as final as a nail being hammered into a coffin. Each mark was a tombstone, each line was a life. There was a mark for Isaac, the runaway, a deep, angry gash that she had carved with such intensity that splinters had driven themselves under her fingernails. There was a mark for the infant who had died of a fever, a small, hesitant line, as if the wood itself had wept. There was a mark for the old woman who had simply collapsed in the field, her heart giving out after a lifetime of labor. There were marks for the men and women sold away, their families rent asunder, their presence on the plantation erased as completely as if they had never existed. But she remembered. The wall was her memory, a growing, terrible scripture of suffering. In the first year, there were 7 marks. By the 5th year, the number had grown to 32. By the 10th year, the wall behind her pallet was a dense, horrifying forest of vertical lines, a silent testament to the human cost of the white columns and the green fields. The act of carving was her only true solace. It was a declaration that these lives, these souls, had mattered. They were not just entries in the planter's ledger, listed under assets and losses. Here, on this hidden wall, they were remembered, and their loss was recorded as a debt that was still owed. This secret accounting, this nightly communion with the dead, began to change her. The passive observer, the vessel of sorrow, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, being forged into something else. The grief did not lessen, but the rage that had been a cold, hard knot in her chest began to find a focus. The ledger was no longer just an act of remembrance. It was becoming an indictment. And an indictment demands a trial. A trial demands a verdict, and a verdict demands a sentence. Her observations during the day took on a new, sharper quality. She was no longer just seeing, she was studying. She was gathering intelligence, mapping the terrain of her enemy's world with the meticulous care of a general planning a campaign. Her duties in the great house gave her unparalleled access. She saw the masters in their moments of unguarded indulgence, and she began to recognize their patterns, the predictable orbits in which their lives of leisure moved. She learned that every 3rd Thursday of the month, the owner of her plantation hosted a gathering. It was a meeting of the local planters, the feudal lords of the surrounding cotton empires. On these nights, as many as 15 of them would convene in the grand dining room. They came to drink, to feast, to gamble, and to discuss the matters that were most important to them. The price of cotton on the Liverpool Exchange, the quality of their racehorses, the latest political news from Washington, and the most effective methods for managing their human property. She served them on these nights, a silent, gliding shadow moving along the periphery of their brilliant, candlelit world. She refilled their glasses with dark, sweet Madeira and claret from France, her hands steady, her face a blank canvas. But behind the mask, she was a scientist observing a foreign species. She noted who drank the most, whose laughter was the loudest and most cruel, whose temper was the shortest. She listened to their boasts about the record yields of their fields and the brutal punishments they had devised to ensure such productivity. She learned their names, not the formal titles they used with one another, but the names that were whispered with fear and hatred in the cabins. The colonel, the judge, the preacher. Men who cloaked their barbarism in the vestments of civilization. She memorized their faces, the way their skin would flush with wine and exertion, the way their eyes would glitter with a casual, confident arrogance. She committed every detail to memory, cross-referencing it with the silent, growing ledger on her wall. The man who bragged of having worked 3 field hands to death during the last harvest was the owner of the plantation from which a young woman, sold to him, had thrown herself into the river rather than submit to his bed. The woman had a mark on the wall. The planter now had a face and a name. She also studied the house itself, the theater of their power. She learned its rhythms, its secrets. She knew which doors creaked and which were always kept locked. She knew the location of the oil stores, the large, pungent barrels of whale oil used to fuel the lamps that turned night into day for the masters. She knew the schedule of the overseer, Philemon, knew that on the nights of these gatherings he would drink himself into a stupor in his own small cottage, his vigilance dissolved in cheap whiskey. She learned that the masters, in their drunken revelries, would often lock the main doors from the inside, a strange, paranoid gesture to ensure their privacy and security, to keep the dark world of the fields from intruding upon their sanctuary of light and luxury. They believed the thick oak doors and the glass-paned windows were their fortress. She was beginning to see them as the walls of a tomb. Her methodical study was punctuated by small, almost invisible acts of defiance. These were not acts of rebellion, they were experiments. They were probes, designed to test the system's weaknesses, to gauge its response times, to understand its vulnerabilities. One evening, she accidentally dropped a small, foul-smelling herb into the water being heated for the master's bath. The herb, harmless but potent, filled the entire upper floor of the house with a lingering, unpleasant odor that took days to dissipate. The mistress of the house flew into a rage, blaming the other servants, but no one suspected a deliberate act. It was dismissed as carelessness, an incompetence that was to be expected. The woman observed the chaos, the confusion, the inability of the masters to even conceive of a world where such a thing could be an act of will. She had learned something valuable about their arrogance. On another occasion, she learned that a key to the smokehouse, a place where the plantation's most valuable food stores were kept, had a tendency to fall from its hook if the door was slammed shut. One afternoon, knowing the overseer was at the far end of the property, she engineered the event. The key fell, unseen, into a patch of tall grass. The resulting search, the frustration, the disruption to the plantation's routine lasted for half a day. She watched as the rigid, unyielding order of their world was thrown into disarray by the absence of a single, small piece of metal. She learned that their system, for all its apparent strength, was brittle, heavily reliant on routine and predictability. It had no resilience, no ability to adapt to the unexpected. These small acts were her training. They honed her nerves, sharpened her instincts, and confirmed her theories. She was not just a survivor, a passive victim of a cruel fate. She was a strategist, a patient, calculating mind hidden in plain sight. She was a woman preparing for a war that only she knew she was fighting. The other slaves saw her silence and mistook it for resignation. They saw her efficiency and mistook it for obedience. They could not see the cold, burning fire in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. They could not see the wall behind her bed. They could not see the web of information she was spinning in her mind. A web of timetables, weaknesses, and patterns. A web that was slowly, patiently being woven around the 15 men who believed themselves to be the masters of the universe. The years passed. The tally marks on the wall grew into a dense, overlapping thicket. The number of dead, sold, and broken souls for whom she stood as the sole accountant was now well over 100. Her body aged, her hands grew calloused, but the purpose within her did not waver. It grew harder, colder, more refined, like steel being tempered in a slow fire. She was no longer waiting for a sign or for an opportunity. She was waiting for the perfect alignment of circumstances, a confluence of events that her studies had taught her was inevitable. She needed a night when all 15 of them were present. She needed a night when their arrogance was at its peak, their senses dulled by food and wine. She needed a night when the overseer would be insensible, and she needed a night when the very elements, the sky itself, would provide her with cover. She watched the patterns of the weather with the same intensity she watched the patterns of the men. She learned the signs of the great summer thunderstorms that would roll in from the Gulf, storms that could drown out the sound of the world. She was ready. The ledger was full. The plan was complete. A perfect, intricate mechanism of retribution constructed from a decade of silent observation. All that was required was the final, triggering event. It came on a Tuesday afternoon in August. A young boy, no more than 12, was caught attempting to teach another child how to read, using a piece of charcoal on a scrap of wood. The crime was not theft or violence. The crime was knowledge. For this, the overseer, Philemon, beat him with a stick until the boy could no longer stand. As the woman tended to the boy's wounds later that night, she felt the last vestiges of her patience, the final, thin membrane of restraint, dissolve. She went to her pallet, her face as calm and as still as the surface of a deep, dark lake. She reached behind it and retrieved her piece of flint. She carved a new mark on the wall, not for a death, but for a promise. The line was straight, deep, and final. Her period of accounting was over. The time for settlement had arrived. And then came the night when silence ended. The day of the third Thursday of August dawned with a malevolent stillness. The air was a thick, suffocating soup, so heavy with moisture that it felt as if the sky itself were sweating. Not a single leaf stirred on the great live oaks. The sun was a diffuse, white-hot disk behind a thin, milky haze that did nothing to diminish its power, succeeding only in turning the world into a vast, shadowless steam bath. Sounds were muffled and distorted in the dense atmosphere. The distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the shouts of the field hands, all of it seemed to reach the ear robbed of its sharpness, as if traveling through water. The birds were silent. The insects, usually a ceaseless, droning orchestra, had fallen quiet. It was a weather breeder's day, a day of profound, unnatural calm that was merely the deep breath a storm takes before it unleashes its fury. The woman knew the signs. She had watched the sky every morning for a decade. She felt the coming tempest not as a prediction, but as a certainty, a palpable pressure against her skin, an electrical charge in the very marrow of her bones. The heavens were aligning with her purpose. Her movements throughout that day were a masterpiece of calculated normalcy. She performed her duties in the great house with the same silent, unobtrusive efficiency that had defined her existence for years. She polished the silver until it shone with a cold, pristine brilliance, her hands steady, her reflection a distorted, fleeting ghost in the curved surfaces of the spoons and goblets. She swept the wide plank floors of the dining hall, her broom making a soft, rhythmic, whispering sound, a sound of secrets being kept. She was a phantom in plain sight, her every action a lie, a carefully constructed performance designed to conceal the raging, methodical tempest within her. The mistress of the house commented to a guest that the woman was a treasure, so reliable, so blessedly untroubled by the moods and complaints that afflicted the others. The woman heard the comment, registered it, and filed it away with all the other countless underestimations that had been her greatest shield. Her true work, the work she had been preparing for all her life, would not begin until the sun went down. As the afternoon wore on, the sky in the west began to curdle, the hazy white slowly bruising into shades of slate gray and a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The masters began to arrive for their gathering, their carriages rattling up the long, oak-lined drive, their horses skittish and nervous, sensing the coming break in the weather. They were a parade of Southern aristocracy, 15 men who collectively owned thousands of acres of land and thousands of human souls. They greeted each other on the grand veranda with loud, hearty booms of laughter and firm handshakes, their voices full of the easy, unthinking confidence of men who had never in their lives had a single one of their assumptions about the world challenged. They were oblivious to the two storms that were gathering to meet that night, the one in the heavens and the one that was standing silently by the door, waiting to take their coats. While they settled in the dining room, their voices rising in volume as the first bottles of wine were opened, the woman began her final preparations. Her movements were now governed by a precise, internal clock, each action planned and rehearsed 1,000 times in the theater of her mind. Her first objective was the oil. The plantation's main supply was kept in a small, windowless shed behind the kitchen, a place that smelled perpetually of whale oil, a thick, pungent, fishy odor. The shed was locked, but she had studied the lock for years. It was old and rusted, its mechanism worn and loose. She had experimented with a thin piece of wire, learning its secrets, mapping its tumblers. As dusk fell and the first distant rumble of thunder echoed across the fields, she slipped out the back door of the kitchen, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. The air was electric, the world held in a strange, greenish twilight. She reached the shed, her heart a steady, slow drum in her chest. The wire slid into the lock. A twist, a jiggle, a faint, satisfying click. The door swung open. Inside, the barrels stood in silent, greasy ranks. She did not need a barrel. She needed a delivery system. She had secreted away 2 large, empty watering cans from the garden, and over the course of several tense, heart-stopping minutes, she filled them, the thick, viscous oil making a soft, gurgling sound as it poured. Her second objective was the kindling. She had been gathering it for weeks, small, secret caches of dry, resinous pine shavings, stripped bark, and discarded, oil-soaked rags, hiding them in a hollowed-out log near the edge of the woods. With the watering cans now staged in the deep shadows behind a row of overgrown azalea bushes, she retrieved her bundles of tinder. She moved with the silent, fluid grace of a nocturnal predator, her senses preternaturally sharp. She could smell the rain on the wind, a clean, earthy scent that momentarily cut through the oppressive humidity. She could feel the subtle vibrations in the ground as another carriage, a late arrival, made its way up the drive. The storm was getting closer. The thunder was no longer a distant rumble. It was a series of sharp, percussive cracks that sounded like the sky itself was splitting apart. Inside the great house, the gathering was reaching its peak. The dining room was an island of brilliant, golden light and loud, boisterous sound in the growing darkness. The air was thick with the smells of roasted meat, sweet wine, and expensive cigar smoke. The 15 masters were well into their cups, their faces flushed, their conversation a slurry of boasts, jokes, and casual cruelties. They were celebrating a particularly profitable season, a bumper crop that had further solidified their wealth and their sense of divine favor. They were insulated from the world, encased in their bubble of privilege, their senses dulled by food and drink, their arrogance a fortress. They were utterly, blissfully unaware of the silent, methodical preparations that were being made just beyond their brightly lit windows. They heard the rising wind and the increasingly frequent cracks of thunder, and remarked that it was going to be a rough night, a good night to be indoors, safe and warm by the fire. The woman watched them from the hallway, a tray of empty glasses balanced on her hand. She took a final inventory of their faces, cross-referencing them one last time with the names and the crimes stored in her memory. They were all there. The colonel, who had ordered a man whipped for looking at his wife. The judge, who had sold a woman's children to a trader from another state and then had laughed when she begged him for mercy. The preacher, who quoted scripture to justify the buying and selling of human flesh. All 15 of them. Her ledger was complete. Her jury was assembled. She slipped back into the kitchen, placed the tray on a table, and then, with a final, deliberate movement, she slid the heavy iron bolt on the kitchen's service door, the last remaining exit from the dining wing of the house. The storm broke with a sudden, biblical fury. The sky opened, and the rain came down not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. It hammered against the tin roof of the kitchen, a deafening, percussive roar that drowned out all other sound. The wind howled through the great oaks, their branches groaning and thrashing as if in agony. A flash of lightning bleached the world white for a split second, followed instantly by a crack of thunder so loud and so close that it shook the very foundations of the house, rattling the windows in their frames and causing the crystal glasses on the dining room table to chime with a high, terrified note. The masters, startled, let out a collective, nervous laugh, their bravado momentarily punctured by the raw, untamable power of the storm. It was, in this moment, under the cover of this elemental chaos, that the woman made her move. She slipped out into the deluge, the cold rain, a shocking, welcome baptism on her skin. She was no longer a servant. She was no longer a slave. She was an instrument of a justice that had been delayed for far too long. The storm had broken, and so had she. The rain was a solid, vertical wall of water, a liquid curtain that rendered the world beyond a few feet a churning, indecipherable chaos. It was a biblical deluge, a storm that seemed intent on washing the world clean, on scouring the sins from the very soil. For the woman, this elemental fury was not a hindrance, it was a cloak. The roaring of the wind and the ceaseless, deafening drumming of the rain on the roof provided a perfect, impenetrable shield of sound, masking her movements, swallowing the small, incriminating noises of her work. The lightning, which flashed with a manic, strobe-like frequency, was her only illumination, each brilliant, blue-white pulse revealing the world in a series of stark, frozen tableaus. The great house, its windows glowing with a warm, golden light, the thrashing, tormented branches of the ancient oaks, and her own small, determined figure, drenched and resolute, moving with a chilling, unhurried purpose. Her first target was the main entrance. The grand, double doors of the front portico were the primary artery of the house, the symbolic threshold of the master's power. She hefted one of the heavy, sloshing watering cans, the whale oil within a cold, dead weight. With a steady, practiced motion, she began to pour, not in a frantic splash, but in a deliberate, methodical line, soaking the base of the thick, paneled oak doors. The oil, dark and viscous, clung to the wood, seeping into the grain, its pungent, fishy smell, a sharp, acrid note that was almost immediately washed away by the clean scent of the rain. She drenched the welcome mat, the floorboards of the veranda, the ornate wooden columns that supported the roof. She was not just building a fire. She was drawing a line, creating a barrier of chemical promise that would ensure there would be no escape. From the front, she moved to the sides of the house, a shadow flitting between the lightning flashes. The dining room, where the 15 masters were ensconced, was lined with tall, elegant, floor-to-ceiling windows. These were the house's eyes, the portals through which the masters viewed their domain. Tonight, they would become the vents for a hell of their own making. She poured the oil along the base of each window, soaking the sills, the frames, the dry, climbing vines of ivy that clung to the brickwork. Through the rain-streaked glass, she could see them, their figures distorted and wavering as if viewed through a heat haze. They were still laughing, still drinking, their faces flushed and animated in the warm, steady glow of the candelabras. One of them, the colonel, stood and raised his glass, proposing a toast. His mouth moved, but the roaring of the storm swallowed his words, rendering his moment of triumph a silent, pathetic pantomime. They were ghosts already, and they did not know it. Her work on the windows was not merely about fuel, it was about containment. The great house was old, its wood seasoned by decades of hot summers. But the windows were its weak point, panes of fragile glass that could be easily shattered. A man desperate to escape a fire would not hesitate to throw a chair, a bottle, his own body through one. The woman had foreseen this. In her caches of kindling, she had also stored lengths of heavy, rusted chain she had scavenged over the years from broken plows and discarded harnesses. Working with a frantic, focused energy, she looped the chains through the large, decorative iron shutters that flanked each window, pulling them tight, binding the shutters to one another, effectively sealing the windows from the outside. The chains clanked and scraped against the brickwork, a harsh, metallic sound that was utterly lost in the cacophony of the storm. She was not just building a fire, she was building a cage. With the perimeter secured and the fuel laid, she returned to the front of the house for the final act. She retrieved her bundles of tinder, the oil-soaked rags and resinous pine shavings she had so carefully gathered. She knelt on the veranda, the rain plastering her thin cotton dress to her skin, her hair a sodden, tangled mat. From a small leather pouch at her waist, she produced a tinderbox, the one tool she had risked everything to steal from the kitchen hearth. Her hands, though cold and wet, were rock steady. She struck the flint against the steel, once, twice. A small shower of sparks fell onto the tinder, sputtered, and died. She struck again, her movements sharp, efficient. A spark caught in a piece of dry, frayed cotton. A tiny, orange ember glowed, a fragile spark of life in the immense, wet darkness. She bent low, shielding it with her body, and blew on it gently, coaxing it, nurturing it. The ember grew, brightened, and a small, tentative flame licked at the edge of the oil-soaked rag. The fire took hold with a sudden, shocking ferocity. It did not grow, it exploded. The whale oil, a fuel designed to burn slowly and steadily in a lamp, behaved very differently when spread over a wide surface and ignited at once. It erupted in a whoosh of brilliant, orange flame that seemed to leap into existence. The fire devoured the tinder, then found the line of oil she had poured. It raced along the veranda floorboards like a living thing, a fiery serpent that bifurcated, one stream heading for the base of the front doors, the other racing along the side of the house, connecting the windows in a single, unbroken chain of combustion. The sound of the fire was a deep, hungry, and terrifying roar, a sound that, for the first time, was able to compete with the sound of the storm. For a long moment, the woman remained kneeling on the lawn, the rain washing over her, the intense heat of the fire a stark contrast to the cold of the night. The great house was now girdled in a necklace of flame, the red and orange light reflecting wildly against the storm-darkened sky, turning the falling raindrops into a shower of glittering, blood-colored jewels. The scene was apocalyptic, a vision of terrible, sublime, and righteous beauty. This was the culmination of a decade of silent suffering, of meticulous planning, of an iron-willed refusal to be broken. This was her ledger, transcribed in a language of fire that everyone, even the masters, would be able to understand. The moment of transfixed observation was broken by a sound from within the house. It was not a scream, it was a sound of confusion, a chair scraping back, a man's voice raised in a question. They had seen the light. The flickering, unnatural glow that was now dancing on the walls of their opulent dining room had finally penetrated their drunken haze. The woman rose to her feet and began to back away, melting into the deeper shadows at the edge of the tree line, her vantage point secure, her work as the architect of this inferno now complete. She was no longer a participant, she was a witness. The confusion inside the house quickly turned to panic. The first real scream was sharp and high-pitched, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. It was followed by a chorus of shouts, the crashing of furniture, the shattering of glass as a thrown bottle struck a wall. The silhouettes in the windows were no longer the leisurely figures of feasting men. They were frantic, jerky shapes, running, stumbling, colliding with one another in a blind, animal panic. They threw themselves at the main doors of the dining room, only to find them barred. They turned to the grand windows, their only other escape route, and hurled chairs and their own bodies against the thick glass. The panes shattered, showering the room with glittering shards, but their desperate lunges were met by the unyielding iron of the chained shutters. They were trapped. The cage had sprung shut. The smoke began to pour into the room, thick, black, and choking, curling under the doors and through the shattered window panes. The fire, feeding on the dry, ancient wood of the house, was now climbing the walls, the flames licking at the eaves of the roof. The screams from inside became more desperate, more ragged, choked off by the smoke. The men were no longer masters of the universe. They were just animals, trapped in a burning box, their fine clothes and their arrogant words offering no protection against the primal, unforgiving element that had been unleashed upon them. The woman watched from the darkness, her face utterly devoid of expression. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel pity. She felt a profound and terrible emptiness, the stillness that comes after a great and necessary storm has passed. She was not watching men burn. She was watching a debt being paid, an account being settled. The question of whether this was justice or revenge or something darker was a question for philosophers and for God. For her, it was simply an act of accounting. The fire raged, consuming the house, consuming the men, consuming the past. The red light painted the clouds, a beacon in the storm, a testament to the night that a nameless, invisible woman had decided to burn the whole world down. The fire burned with an Old Testament fury, a voracious, living entity that seemed determined to erase not just the structure of the great house, but the very memory of its existence. Fueled by the dry heart pine of its ancient frame and the accelerant that had been so methodically applied to its perimeter, the inferno achieved a terrifying, self-sustaining life of its own. It roared into the storm-tossed sky, a colossal pillar of orange and red that punched a hole in the darkness, its light visible for miles, a silent, horrific beacon that painted the undersides of the roiling storm clouds in the colors of fresh spilled blood. The sound of it was a symphony of destruction, the deep, guttural roar of the flames, the sharp, pistol-shot cracks of massive timbers surrendering to the heat, the high, keening whistle of superheated air being drawn into its maw, and, for a time, the faint, desperate, and ultimately futile screams of the men trapped within its incandescent heart. The woman remained in the sanctuary of the shadows, a lone, still figure at the edge of the tree line. The rain continued to fall, but the heat from the fire was so intense that it created a pocket of dry, scorching air around the burning structure, turning the raindrops to steam before they could reach the ground. She watched as the roof, its great shingles curling and blackening, finally gave way, collapsing inward with a great, shuddering sigh that sent a shower of sparks and embers spiraling up into the night sky like a swarm of demonic fireflies. The house was no longer a house. It was a kiln, a great, open-topped crucible in which the architects of her world were being rendered down to their constituent elements of ash and bone. She felt no satisfaction, no elation, only the profound, hollowed-out calm of a task completed. The ledger was balanced. The final entry had been made. She knew she could not stay. The fire was an alarm bell that would soon draw the entire countryside. Overseers, patrols, neighbors, they would all come running, their faces a mixture of shock and a deep, primal fear. When they arrived, their first question would not be how, but who. And in a world built on a foundation of rigid, brutal racial hierarchies, their suspicion would fall, immediately and irrevocably, upon the enslaved. There would be interrogations, torture, and executions. An example would have to be made, a demonstration of power to remind everyone that even in the face of such a cataclysm, the old order would not be broken. The woman had not come this far, had not planned with such meticulous care for a decade, only to be caught in the indiscriminate dragnet of their vengeance. Her act was not a suicide mission, it was an act of liberation, and liberation had to be absolute. As the first, faint hint of dawn began to dilute the oppressive darkness in the eastern sky, she turned her back on the burning pyre of her past and walked away. She did not run. Her movements were as deliberate and as unhurried as they had been when she was pouring the oil. She moved not north, toward the promise of a freedom she did not believe in, but west, deeper into the swamps, into the vast, trackless wilderness that the planters both feared and exploited. The swamp was a place of primordial chaos, a labyrinth of black water, cypress knees, and tangled, impenetrable thickets, a world that did not obey the neat, straight lines of the cotton fields. To the masters, it was a place of disease, danger, and fugitive slaves. To the woman, it was a sanctuary. It was a place where a person could disappear. She melted into the smoke in the pre-dawn mist, her small dark figure swallowed by the immense, indifferent landscape. She left behind no tracks, no witnesses, no evidence of her existence save for the smoldering, blackened ruins of the great house. She vanished as completely as a ghost, leaving behind only the horrifying, inexplicable fact of what she had done. She was never captured. Her name, the one that had been assigned to her, was never connected to the crime. In the official record, the fire at the Devereaux Plantation in the summer of 1830 was a mystery, an unsolved and deeply unsettling anomaly. The official explanation, the one that was settled upon to calm the nerves of the surrounding plantocracy, was that the house had been struck by lightning during the Great Storm, a tragic, freakish act of God. The 15 masters had been the unfortunate victims of a terrible accident. This was the story that was entered into the journals and the letters of the time, the narrative that allowed the world to continue to make sense. But this was not the story that was told in the cabins. Here, in the hushed, clandestine gatherings of the enslaved, a different truth took root and began to grow. The survivors of the Devereaux Plantation, those who had witnessed the fire from a distance, spoke of what they had seen. A few of them, awakened by the roar of the flames, claimed to have seen a figure silhouetted against the inferno. They spoke of a woman, standing perfectly still, her face illuminated by the firelight, her expression not one of horror or of triumph, but of a calm, almost serene finality. They said she had watched the house burn not as an arsonist, but as a judge watching a sentence being carried out. And then, they said, she had turned and walked into the swamp, not like a fugitive fleeing a crime, but like a queen abdicating a throne. These whispers, at first confined to the survivors, soon began to travel. They moved along the invisible network that connected the plantations, passed from one to another by traveling preachers, by runaways, by the men and women who were sold from one estate to the next. The story spread like a slow, underground fire, a rumor that was too powerful, too resonant, to be dismissed. It became a legend, a piece of folklore that was both terrifying and deeply inspirational. They began to call her the Firebringer, the Woman of Ash, the Angel of the Swamp. She was no longer a person, but a symbol, a manifestation of a justice that was otherwise denied to them. Her act became a cautionary tale whispered to the most brutal of overseers, a dark promise of what could happen when a people's suffering reached its breaking point. It also became a beacon of hope, a testament to the fact that the system was not as unassailable as it seemed, that a single, determined individual, armed with nothing but patience and a righteous rage, could bring an empire to its knees. The legend took on a life of its own, growing and changing with each retelling. Some said that she had not been a woman at all, but a spirit of vengeance summoned from the earth itself by the accumulated pain of the land. They said that the storm had been her servant, that she had commanded the lightning to strike the house. Others claimed that she possessed supernatural powers, that she could walk through fire without being burned, that she could command the creatures of the swamp to hide her from her pursuers. They whispered that she still lived in the heart of the great cypress swamp, an immortal, vengeful ghost who watched over them, a silent guardian who would one day return to finish the work she had started. The 15 dead masters were no longer just men. They became symbols of a decadent and corrupt order, their fiery end a just and fitting conclusion to lives built on the suffering of others. The woman, nameless and faceless, became the protagonist of an epic, a foundational myth for a people who were not allowed to have a history of their own. As dawn broke, the full extent of the devastation was revealed. The great house was gone. All that remained was a smoking, blackened skeleton of a foundation, a few skeletal chimneys reaching for the sky like accusing fingers, and the charred, unrecognizable remains of what had once been fine furniture and human bodies. The air for miles around was thick with the stench of wet ash and something else, a sweet, cloying, deeply unsettling smell that was the smell of cooked meat. The storm had passed. The sky was a clear, indifferent blue, and the rising sun illuminated a scene of profound and absolute desolation. The survivors of the plantation wandered through the ruins in a state of dazed shock. Their world had been literally and figuratively turned to ash overnight. The physical embodiment of their oppression was gone, but so was the brutal, predictable order that had structured their lives. They were left in a vacuum, a terrifying and uncertain space between a past that was a smoking ruin and a future that was a complete unknown. The story of the woman without a name became their compass in this new, uncharted territory. It was a story that gave meaning to the chaos, that transformed a senseless tragedy into an act of profound, revolutionary significance. It answered the question that haunted the ruins, the question that hung in the smoke-filled air. Was she real, this woman who had walked out of the fire and into a legend? Or had vengeance itself, the abstract and long-denied desire for justice, finally taken on a human shape, if only for a single, terrible, and glorious night? History does not write her name. It records only the fire, the storm, and the silence that followed. It records only the shadows she left behind. The official ledgers of the antebellum South are documents of meticulous, almost obsessive detail. They record the price of cotton, the yield per acre, the birth and death of livestock, and the purchase, sale, and valuation of human beings. They are monuments of accounting, testaments to a world that believed, with an almost religious fervor, that everything and everyone could be quantified, commodified, and entered onto the correct side of a balance sheet. In all the thousands of pages of these records, in the spidery cursive script of planters and their overseers, There is no mention of a woman who burned 15 men alive. There is no account of a rebellion, no record of a mass execution, no entry that acknowledges the possibility of such a profound and total act of retributive violence. The silence in the historical record is absolute. It is a silence that is as loud and as significant as the roar of the fire that it conceals. History, it is said, is written by the victors, but perhaps it is more accurate to say that history is written by the accountants, by those who control the ledgers. The woman without a name never had a ledger. Her accounts were kept on the splintery surface of a cabin wall and in the silent, unwritten archives of her own memory. Her story does not exist in the world of verifiable facts in cross-referenced sources. It exists in the shadowy, liminal space of folklore, a ghost that haunts the periphery of the official narrative. Her story became a whisper, a current in the great, subterranean river of oral tradition that flowed from one plantation to the next, a body of knowledge and belief that was invisible to the masters, but was as real and as vital to the enslaved as the water they drank and the air they breathed. Her legend became a complex and multifaceted thing. For some, it was a story of caution. It was a dark and terrible tale about the price of rage, a reminder that even the most righteous of furies could consume the one who wielded it. They whispered that the woman, by embracing the fire, had become the fire, that she was doomed to wander the swamps forever, a restless, burning spirit. Her humanity burned away, leaving only a vessel of pure, undiluted vengeance. They told their children to beware of the anger that builds in the dark, for it was a powerful but uncontrollable spirit, a Loa that, once summoned, could not be easily dismissed. This version of the story was a form of self-preservation, a way to counsel patience and endurance in a world where open rebellion was a virtual death sentence. It acknowledged the rage, it honored the desire for justice, but it warned of the terrible, transformative power of violence. For others, and perhaps for most, her story was one of profound and undiluted hope. It was a testament to the enduring power of the human will to resist, even in the most hopeless of circumstances. She was not a monster, she was a hero, a saint of the oppressed. Her act was not one of madness, but of a terrible, transcendent sanity. She was a woman who had looked into the heart of an insane and evil system and had responded in the only language that system could understand. She had refused to be a victim, had refused to be a number in a ledger. Instead, she had become a force of nature, an agent of a divine or elemental judgment that the masters, in their arrogance, had never believed could be turned against them. This version of the story was a secret gospel, a source of spiritual sustenance in a world that starved the soul. It was a promise that no matter how absolute the power of the oppressor seemed, it was never truly absolute. The foundations of the great house were not as deep as they appeared, and a single, well-placed spark could bring the entire rotten structure crashing down. The question of her fate, of what became of the woman after she walked into the swamp, became a central and endlessly debated part of the legend. Some believed she had been taken by the swamp, that she had succumbed to starvation, or disease, or the beasts that lurked in the black water. They saw her as a martyr, one who had sacrificed her life to deliver a single, unforgettable blow against their shared enemy. Others believed she had survived. They imagined her living a solitary, feral existence in the heart of the wilderness, a wild woman who had shed the trappings of her former life and had become one with the landscape. They pictured her as a kind of silent, watchful guardian, a hidden protector of other runaways who sought refuge in the swamp's embrace. And there was a third version of the story, a more audacious and hopeful one. This version held that she had walked right through the swamp and out the other side. It imagined her traveling for weeks, moving only at night, navigating by the stars and by an innate, unshakable sense of direction until she had finally reached the free states of the North. In this telling, she had not just escaped, she had won. She had taken her freedom not as a gift, but as a prize she had claimed through an act of will. The proponents of this version imagined her living out the rest of her days in a quiet, anonymous freedom, an old woman with a terrible and magnificent secret, perhaps sitting by a window in a small room in Philadelphia or Boston, watching the snow fall and remembering a long ago night of fire and rain. This was the most powerful version of the legend, for it suggested that true and total liberation was not just a dream, but a possibility. What does justice look like when history refuses to speak the name of the one who sought it? Perhaps it looks like this. Perhaps it looks like a story that refuses to die, a legend that continues to smolder in the collective memory long after the embers of the fire have gone cold. The woman without a name achieved a different kind of immortality. She was never captured, never tried, never executed. The system that had sought to define her, to own her, to reduce her to a mere instrument of its own enrichment, was never able to close its books on her. She remained an unaccounted-for asset, a debt that could never be collected, a ghost in their machine. Her final, and perhaps greatest, act of defiance was not the fire itself, but her disappearance. She denied her enemies the satisfaction of a conclusion. She denied them her body, her name, and her story. She left them with only questions and fear and the charred, barren ground where their fortress of power had once stood. In the years that followed, it was said that nothing would ever grow again on the patch of earth where the great house had burned. The soil, sterilized by the intense heat and saturated with the ash of the inferno, remained a black, sterile scar on the landscape, a place that even the most tenacious of weeds seemed to shun. It became a taboo place, a piece of haunted ground that the other planters avoided and that the enslaved looked upon with a mixture of awe and reverence. It was a permanent monument, a physical testament to the night that the ledger had been balanced. The woman herself may have been a ghost, a whisper, a legend, but the consequences of her actions were written into the very earth, a story that could be read by anyone who had the courage to look. Her story ends not with a period, but with a question mark. It forces us to sit with the unsettling ambiguity of a justice that is both terrible and necessary, a vengeance that is both horrifying and righteous. It leaves us in the silence, in the space between the official record and the whispered truth, to contemplate the enduring, unquenchable fire of the human spirit. The record on the woman without a name is, and will likely always be, incomplete. Thank you for bearing witness to the echoes she left behind. If you have just found our channel, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive to ensure you are with us when the next file is unsealed. And share your thoughts in the comments on what you believe constitutes true justice when history itself is the scene of the crime.